Hey everyone, this is week 3 qualitative methods, and I have your to-dos for this week that I just wanted to mention, as well as a few reminders. First, of course, review all content, chapters, videos, anything that we have up for week 3. And then you have your writing lab per usual, so make sure to submit your research questions and methods by Sunday night. The third thing is your IRB or city training. So this is again human subjects ethics training, and there are instructions. So it does have a lot of modules for training, and then you take a quiz, and then you read another subject, and then you take another quiz. So make sure to give yourself plenty of time to complete this assignment and to get your IRB certificate. You could maybe knock it out in 2 to 3 hours, but I would probably just space it out over a few days. So just make sure to incorporate that into your timeline for completing the IRB city training. And lastly, if you would like to meet with me, I have another schedule out with a few openings. And of course, if none of those work, just feel free to always email me and ask for other times. Just a few reminders and or kind of updates. This week had an Atlas TI assignment, basically looking at qualitative data, but I'm going to move that to next week. I'll still try to post some content on it, but I'll have another video where we go over how to actually analyze qualitative data. So this week, or for this part 1, I'll say lecture, we're just going to talk about qualitative methods in general. And then also I do have a few updates to the syllabus, which I will actually go over in the next slide. And here we go. Okay, so we are going through CEEF accreditation, and something that came up that we need to incorporate into this class is actually updating. I try to make it as simple as possible, but it's just adding a few things to our end product for this course. So instead of just a proposal, which originally was 60 points and 6 to 8 pages, it's going to be called a proposal portfolio. And here's the new item. So basically what I did was still make it 60 points. So I was trying really not to change anything more about the structure of the class. And I am adding a 1 to 2 page narrative. So because of that, and because I want to make sure to give you all kind of a break on not adding more things, the proposal now is going to be 5 to 7 page paper. That way it just makes a little bit of room for the additional item that I'm including, which is now we're kind of wording it as a proposal portfolio. So again, one, it includes a 5 to 7 page paper. The second item is a 1 to 2 narrative / reflection on your MPH experience, and there will be specific prompts on questions to kind of answer. What did you learn from your core classes? How have you grown as a professional? So just a 1 to 2 page reflection, and then of course there's no really right or wrong answer. It's based on your personal experience. The third thing is to give at least 2 artifacts, which could be an example paper, maybe a group project you did, or some other type of final product. So that's pretty much already done. You just have to pick 2 items that you want to add to this portfolio. And the last thing is the MPH thesis capstone competency form. And it doesn't take too much time to complete. What it is really just looking at all the Masters of Public Health competencies and picking 4 that relate to your proposal. So it might be that your proposal is analyzing evidence-based research, or maybe your proposal includes some type of communication skill. So you just have to look through the competencies and say, oh, what I intend to do for my thesis or capstone matches up with these particular competencies. So again, I try to make this new item not too much more burdensome. So again, I reduce the pages. And so really what you're adding to it is just a short narrative, 2 items that you've already completed, and a form that's really just kind of filling it out and aligning competencies with your proposal. So this is kind of the update. I also updated the syllabus to reflect this. So please let me know if you have any questions. But hopefully I've set it up in a way that's really clear and easy to include these additional items. Okay, chapter 4 is on observational research design. So this week is kind of a continuation of observational designs, and then we'll talk about qualitative methods. Exploratory research. So this is the first link, within research to really identify, what are the basic health issues, especially if you're working with community, what are some of the interests or concerns. So really it's exploratory in nature. And here's an example of a question. How do people over 50 years of age view the idea of being tested for colorectal cancer by use of an at-home test kit? So really answering this question kind of sets the stage for more definitive research. So you're asking, how do people feel about this? And that might help you develop a survey. It might help you develop questions for a focus group. So really this is exploratory in nature, and again, one of the first steps that you might take in research that is relatively new. And this is different from conclusive research. So this is the type where we're saying, okay, what's the cause and effect? It's very narrow. You're often going to use statistics. You're going to use, quantitative methods. But again, like we mentioned last week, to really understand cause and effect, you would have to use an experimental design, particularly a randomized control trial, where you're testing, promotion programs or an intervention. And that is, one of the ways to really get at conclusive research, where you're able to look at cause and effect, because again, you have 2 groups, you're randomizing, so you're kind of spreading out all the different, biases and potential, factors that could, influence a regular program. But by doing a randomized control trial, you're kind of controlling for all of those things. So hence kind of the label. So again, this is more conclusive research where you're really determining cause and effect, versus more observational or exploratory where you're, kind of learning something new for the first time or just basically exploring. So here's another way of kind of looking at it. Exploratory, again, is not really generalizable. You might have a broad question, so it's not clearly defined. You're asking for mostly qualitative information, ideas or feedback or reasons. So you're asking about words. It doesn't mean you can't include quantitative, so it can, but especially if you're exploring something, you might want to start off with more qualitative work. And you're really asking, who, what, where, when, why, how type of questions. Again, it's more observational and tending towards qualitative methods, although you can have some quantitative. Versus the more conclusive type research where you're testing a hypothesis, you're using statistics, you're able to generalize a bit more. It's causal, so you're looking at cause and effect. And this is where you have more of your experimental or quasi-experimental designs, and typically you're using quantitative methods and statistics to really understand and test those hypotheses. And as I mentioned, observational research can either be qualitative, where you are generating hypotheses, and really here the data are words. So you're doing a key informant interview and looking at themes of that interview or themes within several focus groups. So the words are your data. Versus quantitative, here it's all about numbers and testing hypotheses. So again, that's kind of the main difference between qualitative and quantitative. One, the data are words, and then the quantitative, the data are numbers. Now just kind of looking at a basic design for observational research. The most basic is cross-sectional. So this means you're taking a one shot in time, single point of view right at this moment. It really limits cause and effect because for cause and effect, you need more than one data point. And you really need to understand what happened before what, and then there's a bunch of other factors as well. So definitely one of its major weaknesses, but be aware this happens a lot. Someone will do one survey and they say, oh, people had this particular behavior, and they also reported feeling, let's say, depressed. So therefore, this caused that. No. If it's cross-sectional, one of the main things is that you really don't know what caused what. They might be correlated. There might be an association. But again, unless you're doing a true experimental design or randomized control trial, that's the only way you can kind of get at that. So that's one of the weaknesses. But some of the strengths is sometimes you just want to know, depending on your question, what is the current prevalence of XYZ. You need to do a cross-sectional design and, do a survey. It's, one shot. And so sometimes it is appropriate to do that design. And again, it always depends on your question and what you're intending to understand. So here's an example. You have your population, you have a sample, and then there's your snapshot in time, whether it is a survey or some type of observation. And here, you're really able to see in that one shot in time prevalence, of a particular health outcome, population characteristics or demographics, numbers with or without a disease, risk, or other protective factors, and differences among people. But again, it's just that one shot in time. And then you have successive independent sample designs, and it's kind of this variant of cross-sectional design where it's really just multiple cross-sectionals designs, and the same population is sampled, but that doesn't mean the people that you are looking at in that cross-sectional time point, they are not the same people. And the next slide kind of illustrates that a little bit better. So here you go. You have a population, and you're doing your first cross-sectional cross-section number 1, and that's one group of people. A couple months or years later, you do another cross-sectional, and then you do a third. So the most important part here is that you're not following the same people. You're taking a population, sampling, and doing 3 separate cross-sectional, shot in time assessments. So when you're doing this, you can see population level changes. You can see trends, but again, it's not the same people. You're taking multiple cross-sectional snapshots of the population. Now, if you do want to follow people, these designs are known as more like cohort studies or prospective designs. Of course, you're looking at trends, so that might be called trend studies. And this is, study participants are followed, maybe for a few months, years, and, there is some research where participants are followed for decades. The biggest challenge is maintaining contact and trying to make sure you're following everyone, but it is a really great design because it can help determine incidence of disease. You could really just follow a lot of the trends. So this is a really nice longitudinal design. And here's an example. So it looks similar, except instead of taking cross-sections of the population, you're sampling the population, you have a baseline assessment, and then you have follow-ups. But again, these are the same people. So again, you can look at healthy people versus sick people, what happened across time, predictors of health outcomes. So here you can kind of do some prediction because something happened before something else happened because you have more than 2 or at least 2 data points. And then it also helps you with incidence of disease or a particular health outcome. So again, this is a longitudinal design where you're following the same people, often called cohort study, perspective, or trend studies. And then you have case control. This is very much rooted in epidemiology. Cases are those who have a particular disease, and control participants do not. Oftentimes you want to match them as close as possible by sex, age, other key characteristics to make sure they're just as similar as possible, except for whether or not they have a particular disease. Of course, that's really hard, but you do the best you can to kind of match. And instead of moving forward like we did in our last design, this one is retrospective. So you're looking backwards. And this is nice because you can do different types of comparisons, comes up with odd ratios, and really help to identify risk factors for a particular disease. So here's kind of like the depiction of that, where you have a population, but you're taking samples, you're having cases who have a disease and controls who do not. And then you're looking backwards in time. What is their history, and how did they get to, where they currently are? So again, you're looking backwards in time. So case control is a retrospective type design. Okay, so now we're going to do a little bit of qualitative. This could actually be a whole entire course. I've taken, a qualitative course. So that's why I call it at a glance, because we're really just going to talk about it briefly, but hopefully it gives you a good idea around qualitative methods and how to work with qualitative data. So I'm going to go over qualitative research and a little bit of mixed methods and what that is. I'll go into some detail about how to conduct a focus group, which is an example of qualitative research, a method. And then for actually part 2, since we have our assignment, I'm actually moving the assignment back a week. So I kind of called that part 2. We'll actually talk about how to work with data, and then I'll give you an example of some qualitative methods in my own work, and then I'll explain the Atlas TI assignment. Atlas TI is a software that allows you to do some qualitative data analysis. So again, that'll be part 2 of this, this lecture. I always love this quote when I ask students, what is qualitative research? And this one always, I like this quote because it says, it involves finding out what people think and how they feel, or at any rate, what they say they think and how they say they feel. So this information is subjective. So it's not a hard science. You're really asking people, what do you think and what do you feel? Which may or may not reflect how they really feel. But I always thought this quote was really interesting when just thinking about qualitative research. I've mentioned a few ways to collect qualitative data, key informant interviews, focus groups. If you have a survey that has open-ended questions where they're filling out and writing, that's qualitative information. Again, it's just all about words. It could be through an interview, but also testimonials, diaries, journals. That all has to do with words and understanding either a point of view or information. So again, these are all the different types of data collection methods for qualitative research. Now, there are some advantages when you're doing qualitative work. It really yields rich data, and that means you have a lot of data, and sometimes it gets really in depth, and you're able to explore topics in that way. What's nice about it too is that the interviewer can explain or help clarify questions. So there's a little bit of a back and forth. And of course, there's some flexibility in how you administer the interview. So those are just some advantages. Disadvantages, it could be expensive and time consuming. You're taking more time to one, get trained in how to do qualitative interviewing. So you need to be qualified. Sometimes when you're working with people, they might not recall information, or they might have, I like how it says here, selective perceptions. I think that's everybody at some point, right? But the added flexibility, even though it's an advantage, it can also kind of create some inconsistencies across interviews. Sometimes an interview can go in a slightly different direction than other interviews, but of course you want to have an interview guide to make sure that doesn't happen too much, but that can, there can be some inconsistencies. And then just the sheer volume of information. If you think about transcribing maybe an hour interview, speaking with someone, that's probably about 30 to 40 pages of a transcription, and that's just one interview. So if you have 5 interviews, or if you have 3 focus groups, especially when there's a lot of people, you're looking at a lot of information. So you have to take all that information, figure out, how do I reduce this information to codes and then to themes that you can really understand. So again, these are just some of the advantages and disadvantages. Now just looking at quantitative, what's nice about quantitative research is that you can really get large numbers. As I mentioned, with qualitative, you're not interviewing 100 people. That would be insane. You're interviewing, 3 to 5 key informants. You have 3 to 5 focus groups. But with quantitative, you can really, put out a survey and get hundreds of responses. Another advantage is the anonymity of it. It's relatively inexpensive, and I would probably put this in quotes, easy to analyze. With numbers, they're kind of already there. Of course, there's a long process. You got to clean the data, etc., etc. But at least once it's ready to go, it's ready to go. Versus kind of mulling over the different codes and themes, and kind of qualitative can be a little bit of an art. Whereas quantitative, you have the numbers, statistics, and that's, how you can kind of analyze it. Some of the disadvantages is that as you're conducting quantitative work, you might not get as much careful feedback or as much detail as you want. You're really only getting responses to the questions you're asking. Sometimes the wording can be biased, and that influences a response. And sometimes you might have a low response rate, or there's some type of literacy demand. So there are some disadvantages there, but it is nice to have some of the advantages of being able to reach large numbers, and not having to be as well trained and qualified, have a particular skill in interviewing versus when you're administering a large survey, for example. And here's another way of looking at it. Qualitative versus quantitative, the type of question you're able to probe versus limited probing, small sample size versus much larger. Qualitative, you have rich data, so you have a lot of information per person, whereas in quantitative, it can vary. You need specific skills as a researcher to do interviews, and maybe fewer specialized skills for quantitative. That's not necessarily true. Of course, you have to know design, you have to know your statistics. There's a lot of skill involved, but maybe just more so the difference between being a skilled interviewer versus if you had a survey to administer. You could train, several people to do that. The type of analysis is very subjective and interpretive when you're thinking about qualitative research versus, again, with the numbers, it's statistical. One type is more exploratory versus quantitative and descriptive, and you could, even look at causal relationships or cause and effect. So again, this is another way of kind of looking at not just the pros and cons, but, what are the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. And really, for qualitative research, there's a spectrum. Some people want to approach it with kind of where numbers matter. It's a psychometric approach where you're saying, 3 out of the 5 people said this, or 40%. So you're kind of, even though it's qualitative, you're kind of adding numbers to it. So you're very confirmatory, and if there's two people, reading the same transcript, you really care about intercoder reliability. So it's very kind of almost like you're treating it like a quantitative, but it's a very psychometric approach. Versus on the other end of the spectrum, more heuristic. So here it's inductive, what information am I getting? And then you're interpreting. Numbers don't matter as much as understanding themes and exploring and just really thinking about, what is the storyline here? What is, the message or the information, and how do we interpret it? So again, it's kind of a spectrum between the heuristic approach, kind of, numbers don't matter. I'm really interested in just the themes and really understanding, versus even though it's qualitative work, I care about how many people said it, and that is very reliable in the way that we're coding, for example. So again, that's just a little bit of a spectrum. Error reconcilable differences. I just always think this cartoon is funny. How do you choose, which way to go? I think it's always just about making sure your research question matches the method that you choose. Well, here, I'll read this cartoon. It says, I have the ability to quantify the unquantifiable. That is why they call me Dogbert the Quantifier. Who calls you that? 8 people. So probably not as many people as you would think. Maybe he needs a larger sample size there. Maybe more quantitative methods. I don't know. But sometimes there's also kind of this idea that those in anthropology and sociology and other types of departments or fields, they mostly do qualitative work. But I would beg to differ and say, yes, there's certain areas that are more quantitative and use more math and statistics, and more that kind of explore more qualitative work. But again, it depends on the question. If your question is exploratory and it's something new, putting out a survey might not be the best first approach. You still want to gather some information. And if you're researching something that already has a ton of information, you're not asking some of the basic questions in an exploratory fashion that have already been answered. So again, it just kind of depends. And this is a picture of 2 people, again, kind of stereotyping, eating in front of a sociology department, saying, I love our lunches out here, but I always feel like we're being watched. And so those are just a couple of funny cartoons. Oh, here's another one. The way I feel is hard to quantify. How hard on a scale of 1 to 10? So now you're kind of getting this idea of a mismatch. Like I said, it always depends on your research question. So here they're saying, the way I feel is hard to quantify. He wants to talk about it. He wants more of that qualitative assessment. And then the researcher's like, well, just give me 1 to 10. Again, kind of minimizing the information and not getting that depth that you would in a true qualitative assessment. So when to use what? I think I've kind of belabored it a little bit. Again, if it's more unfamiliar, exploratory, you're interested in meaning rather than frequencies, that's more qualitative. If the subject matter is well defined, there's measurement involved, it's numerical, you're interested in repeat measures, and you want to generalize, then that's more quantitative, and that's the more of the direction that you would take. So here are just 2 examples of other things to think about when you're asking, when do I use which method? But a lot of times you combine. So this is what we call mixed methods. You might first ask, what do you think about something, and then gather that information, have reasons, or have, the qualitative data that then informs your next step of your research. And this is used a lot in theory development, constructing surveys, maybe helping inform and understand pre-tests, testing out some intervention materials. So it's really understanding the process. So kind of asking first, and then having that help inform some of your quantitative work. And again, this is very typical also in evaluation. And this is from a paper that I didn't have you read, but I just wanted to kind of illustrate, if you're doing formative work, it might be qualitative, informing your quantitative. If it's theory development, it might be qualitative, then quantitative, and then getting information back and doing it again. Now let's ask again. Now let's do the survey and see if that worked. Well, we got some feedback, so it's qualitative, quantitative. Or you're developing an instrument and it's just straight qualitative to quantitative. So again, this is kind of a few different types of project phases and the different types of design, but really the point here is just to show you that you can have a back and forth with qualitative and quantitative, and looking at the different types of data collection. It could be focus groups, interviews leading to a survey, for example, instrument development or validation. So again, the use of mixed methods is really popular, and again, it depends on your research question. What is it that you're trying to understand, and how would you use these two methods and approaches to best either design something or best understand the question that you have. And just here's another example of program development. Again, it's back and forth with qualitative and quantitative. And then evaluation research could be both. I want to ask people how they felt about something, but I also want to quantify it. So you can have both and use that, if you have some type of intervention that you're evaluating or some other experiment. Okay, focus groups. What are focus groups? Focus groups are small group discussions. You're trying to extract experiences and perspectives. You're exploring a specific area of interest in somewhat detail. You're going to have some questions prepped. But the thing about focus groups is that interaction is also key. So sometimes they feed off of each other. So it's not just a one-on-one interview, like a key informant interview. The interaction is kind of key, and it also matters. But because you have such a small group, you typically can't generalize these findings. But it does give you an idea of where to start. Generally, your focus groups are 6 to 10 people. Depending on where you are, timing, community, and experience, you'll know whether to kind of over-recruit. In some studies, I knew that I was only going to get 50% attendance, so I would, recruit, twice that. In some, I knew most people would make it. So you really just have to think about, where you are, who you're working with, the time and the setting, but always think about over-recruiting slightly. And then also, depending on your question, are you going to go in with narrow topics or broad topics? Saturation is the idea that when you start to hear the same information over and over again, you are saturated. You pretty much have all the information you need. And sometimes we use this term to figure out, when are you going to be done? How many focus groups, or interviews should you do? Maybe you planned on doing 5, but after just 3, you're already hearing the same information. You're like, well, it might kind of belabor it to do a 4th and a 5th focus group because you're already hearing the same information over and over again, which means you've hit saturation. So that's just a concept within qualitative work as well. Again, once you start hearing the same information over again and you stop hearing anything new. Just a few interviewing tips. You always want to keep the language pitched at that of the respondent. Avoid long questions. Make sure to create a comfortable environment. Always be respectful. And as I've mentioned, always have a protocol so that you're following specific guidelines, and that just helps with interviewing in general. You want to avoid 2 things. Well, a lot of things, but here are 2. You want to avoid leading questions, and you want to avoid double-barreled questions. So leading questions, they can, bias the response because you're kind of influencing, how someone should respond. You might be making assumptions about the respondent or how they already feel. Or if you have a leading question, it might, have a positive or negative appeal depending on the type of language. So one leading question, especially if you're doing evaluation, is tell me what you liked. Even as simple as tell me what you liked about the study could be somewhat leading, because what if they didn't like anything? You're already assuming something. So those are just the type of things when you're reading a question. The way that I do it is I think, am I already giving them the answer? And so if I feel like I'm giving a hint or I'm giving part of the answer, then I know I'm kind of leading. Or if you're making assumptions, that's kind of a leading question. And a double-barreled question is really just that. You're almost like you're asking two questions in one. Like, do you, meet the guidelines for physical activity and healthy eating? Really, to make it more simple, just ask one question at a time. It avoids ambiguity. It avoids, having multiple responses, kind of confusing everyone. So again, try to make sure that you're asking one simple question at a time. And then I talked a little bit about, when you're doing qualitative interviews, there's some skill to it. You have to be really great at probing. So here's a question, and again, maybe it's a little biased, it's a little bit leading, but it says, what did you like best about this program? So, okay, maybe, we could have worded it a little bit differently, but let's say a respondent says, I liked everything. Someone who knows how to probe might say, well, what's one thing that stood out? And the respondent says, being with friends. And then they say, what about program activities? Okay. This is where I probably would have said, tell me more about why being with friends stood out to you. So again, you're kind of getting more information. I felt like the second probe kind of said, okay, and then kind of cut to a different theme. So they said, what about program activities? I like it when we work in teams. So then they continued and said, how come? And then the person said, it was neat to hear each other's perspectives, and I heard things I hadn't considered before. So again, that's a nice answer, but then you can probe again and say something like, what is one example of something that you learned? So again, the nice thing about qualitative research and interviewing is you can really get rich information and you can get into the details, continue to probe, and get answers. So we know that they like to work in teams, they like to hear others' perspectives, and then hopefully this interview also had an example. So this is what is really nice, again, about qualitative work. Okay, cultural considerations. When you're designing really anything, you always have to have your audience in mind. Whether it's, how you're conducting an interview, a focus group, how your wording is in a survey, it's important to take into account culture. And so theories are explanations of behaviors that are often particular to one's worldview. But a lot of the research, well, nowadays it's a little bit different, but historically, a lot of the research that have been done, would be ineffective if you're not taking into consideration who you're working with, the community, culture, because typically a lot of these older theoretical frameworks or interventions, and a lot of times even, a lot of medical knowledge, we know from working with mainstream communities. So if you are working with a particular communities, oftentimes it's really important to consider culture and community and how might that change either in your approach, your understanding of how to word questions, or even the use of language itself. Now there are two different types, just kind of thinking about, psychology, and I remember this, these subjects in undergrad, but there are largely two different types of cultures. You have individualistic and collectivistic. Individualistic cultures, really identity is very central to the individual, their identity. And it a lot of times is promoting individual choice, differences are respected, and it really fosters independence, including individual achievement. Collectivistic cultures your identity is not so focused on you and your own choices, but it's based on a group and who you belong with. So there's this attachment to groups, there's more interdependence, and some hierarchy, so whether gender, family background, age, and there's this adherence to norms, especially around respect for authority and elders. And so, depending on who I'm working with, how this kind of comes into play is somewhat in the approach, especially when building relationships, and of course down to how you word things in a survey or in a focus group. But on the surface, when I'm in, I'll say like mainstream, academic, culture, the way that I introduce myself is, I am Christina, I'm at this university. Depending on where I am, I'm introducing my background and like where I got my degrees. When I'm working with specific communities, if I were to approach and introduce myself that way, I know they'd be like, who do you think you are? Those individualistic things are not important. Tell me about your family and who are you the daughter of? And I've kind of learned that along the way, and sometimes I've made mistakes. But especially, for example, working with Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders is very collectivistic, and the way that you introduce yourself is not really about you. It's really about your family and a group and how you came to be, but again, it's always connected to family. And then just understanding, either way, what are specific cultural norms helps you understand and helps you build relationships, and especially if you're working, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, you want to make sure that you're being mindful and respectful, and that helps ultimately get the best information that you need. Okay, so that was just a little bit on qualitative, some observational design, a review, but a lot of this was just basically what is, qualitative work and research. Part 2, I'm actually going to do in a different video. I'll try to get it uploaded this week, but our assignment that's going to be linked to part 2, which is I have data, now what, is going to include an Atlas TI assignment. And again, it was initially due this Sunday, but I've extended it 1 week so that I will have part 2 of this video where we're actually going to look and have data and then explore what to do with it. How do you analyze qualitative data? And then second, for the assignment, how do you use software such as Atlas TI to help with this type of analysis? So stay tuned for part 2 of having data and what you're going to do with it.